Some truths don't need words. They just need a heartbeat. The clinic room was quiet except for the soft, rhythmic thump echoing from the monitor. A steady pulse filling the sterile air as Zariah Coleman lay still, eyes fixed on the ceiling, her fingers curled tightly against her side like she was holding herself together piece by piece. While across the room, Ethan Whitmore stood frozen, his tailored coat still draped over his arm, his presence too large for a space this small, too controlled for a moment this fragile. And yet the second that sound reached him, something in his expression cracked, subtle but undeniable, because the image on that screen, grainy, black and white, flickering with life, felt too familiar in a way logic couldn't explain. And when the technician smiled softly and stepped back, leaving silence behind, Ethan took one step forward without realizing it, his eyes narrowing, his breath slowing, as if his entire world had just narrowed down to that single point of light pulsing on the screen. And Zariah noticed, of course she did, but she didn't turn her head, didn't acknowledge him, because she had already lived through the part where he mattered, and she wasn't about to revisit it now. Not like this, not with everything at stake. So she simply reached for the printed sonogram the technician offered, her movements calm, deliberate, controlled, the kind of control that only comes from learning how to survive alone. And when she sat up, adjusting the thin hospital sheet around her, Ethan finally spoke, his voice lower than expected, quieter, stripped of its usual authority. "How far along is she?" The question hung in the air, strange and misplaced, because he hadn't asked her name, hadn't asked if she was okay, hadn't even acknowledged the past that stood between them like a wall built from silence. And Zariah finally turned then, slowly, meeting his gaze with a steadiness that didn't flinch, didn't soften, didn't invite anything. "Far enough," she said, her voice even, her tone carrying no anger, no warmth, just truth. And it hit harder than anything else could have, because Ethan wasn't used to being spoken to without reaction, without adjustment, without fear. And for a moment, he didn't know what to do with that. So he defaulted to control, straightening slightly, his jaw tightening as his eyes flicked back to the image still, glowing faintly on the screen. "You should have told me," he said. And there it was, the shift, the assumption that he had a place in this, that he had a right to this moment. And Zariah stood then, sliding off the exam table with quiet strength, the paper crinkling beneath her as she stepped into her shoes, holding the sonogram like it was something sacred, something earned, not something owed. And when she walked past him, close enough for him to catch the faint scent of her perfume, something clean, something grounded, she didn't stop, didn't hesitate, just said, "You already showed me who you were," and kept walking, leaving him standing there with nothing but a fading echo of a heartbeat he couldn't ignore. Because for the first time in years, Ethan Whitmore wasn't in control of the narrative, and somewhere deep down, he knew this wasn't a situation he could fix with money, strategy, or influence. Because this wasn't about power, it was about truth, and truth had a way of waiting until the exact moment you couldn't escape it before making itself known. The hallway outside the clinic felt colder than it should have, the kind of cold that did not come from temperature, but from something shifting beneath the surface. And Zariah Coleman stepped into it without slowing down, her hand tightening slightly around the folded sonogram, as if it grounded her, as if it reminded her that everything she needed was already in her grasp. And behind her, the door opened again, the soft click echoing louder than it should have, as Ethan Whitmore followed, his footsteps measured but no longer distant, no longer detached, because something had changed in that room, and he could feel it slipping out of his control with every step she took away from him. "Zariah," he called, her name unfamiliar on his tongue after so long. But she did not stop immediately. She let the silence stretch just long enough to remind him that he no longer dictated the pace of this conversation. And only then did she pause near the glass exit doors, the late afternoon light spilling in across the polished floor, framing her in a quiet kind of strength that did not need attention to exist. She turned slightly, not fully facing him, just enough to acknowledge his presence without inviting it, and Ethan closed the distance between them, his expression tighter now, more focused, as if he was trying to piece together a situation that refused to fit into any strategy he had ever mastered. "You disappeared," he said, the words coming out more like an accusation than a question, and Zariah let out a small breath, not quite a laugh, not quite frustration, something in between that carried the weight of memory without giving it power. "No," she said calmly. "You just stopped looking," and that landed harder than anything else, because Ethan was not a man who missed details. He built his entire empire on seeing what others overlooked, on predicting outcomes before they happened, and yet here he was, standing in front of a truth he had not seen coming, a truth that had been there all along, growing quietly without his knowledge, without his permission, and for a moment, he did not have a response, which was rare, unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. So he shifted, his gaze dropping briefly to the sonogram in her hand before lifting back to her face, searching for something he could recognize, something he could control. "You should have told me," he repeated, but this time the words lacked conviction, as if even he could hear the weakness in them. And Zariah finally turned fully toward him, her posture straight, her eyes steady, not angry, not emotional, just certain. "What would that have changed?" she asked, not raising her voice, not challenging him, simply stating a fact that did not need emphasis. And Ethan opened his mouth, then stopped, because the answer did not come easily, because every version of it led back to the same place, to the same moment he had walked away without looking back. And Zariah watched that realization settle over him, slow and quiet, like something heavy finding its place, and she nodded once, as if confirming what she already knew, then reached for the door, pushing it open as a rush of city noise filled the space between them. Car engines, distant voices, the normal rhythm of a world that had not stopped just because it had shifted, and she stepped outside, the sunlight catching against her skin, warming what the clinic had left cold. And for a second, Ethan remained where he was, standing just inside the doorway, caught between two versions of reality, the one he had built and the one he had just discovered. And then he followed again, because walking away this time felt different, felt impossible. "I need to understand," he said, his voice firmer now, but still lacking the authority it once carried with her. And Zariah did not slow, did not turn. She just kept walking down the sidewalk, blending into the flow of people moving through their own lives, their own stories, none of them aware of the shift happening just feet away. "You had your chance to understand," she said. Her words carried lightly over her shoulder, but they stayed with him, heavy and unshakable. And Ethan stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, watching her disappear into the crowd, the sonogram still visible in her hand until it was not, until she was just another figure moving forward without him. And for the first time in years, he did not reach for his phone, did not call an assistant, did not issue a command to fix what felt broken, because something told him this was not a situation that could be handled from a distance, not a problem that could be delegated or solved with a signature. And as the city moved around him, loud and indifferent, Ethan Whitmore stood still, replaying the sound of that heartbeat in his mind, steady, undeniable, and entirely out of his control. That night, the city stretched wide and indifferent beneath a sky that never fully darkened, and Ethan Whitmore stood alone in his penthouse, floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting a version of himself he barely recognized, his tie loosened, his jacket discarded somewhere behind him, his usual precision replaced by something unsettled, something he could not quite name. And for the first time in years, the silence in the room was not controlled. It was loud, pressing in on him with every second. That passed, because no matter how many times he tried to redirect his thoughts, they returned to the same image, the same sound, that steady heartbeat echoing in a space where he had not been invited, where he had not even known to look. And he exhaled slowly, dragging a hand across his face as if that could clear it. But it did not. Nothing did. Not the city lights, not the distant hum of traffic 30 floors below, not even the familiar weight of his phone in his hand, screen, lighting up with messages he normally would have answered without hesitation. But tonight, he ignored them, because none of them mattered in the way that moment had. None of them shifted something fundamental in him the way her words had. "You already showed me who you were." And the truth in that sentence did not come from anger. It came from certainty, which made it harder to dismiss, harder to rewrite. And Ethan did not like what that meant. He did not like the version of himself it forced him to confront. So he turned away from the glass, crossing the room with restless energy until he stopped at his desk, fingers pressing against the polished surface as he tried to regain control of the situation the only way he knew how. by reconstructing it, by finding the missing pieces, by turning it into something solvable. And that was when it started, not as a full memory, but as fragments, small and incomplete, slipping into place whether he wanted them to or not. A night that had never seemed important enough to revisit, now demanding his attention in a way that would not be ignored. The low lighting of a private event, the quiet hum of conversation, the way she had stood apart from the noise without trying to draw attention, and he remembered noticing that, briefly, not because she asked for it, but because she did not, because there was something grounded about her, something steady in the way she held herself, and he had approached her without thinking too much about it. The way he approached most things in his life, direct, controlled, assuming the outcome would follow his lead, and for a while, it had. Conversation that did not feel forced, a connection that did not require effort, and then morning, always morning, because that was where everything shifted, where everything ended for him. A decision made quickly, cleanly, without hesitation, without looking back, because that was how he operated. He moved forward. He did not linger. He did not complicate what did not need to be complicated. And for years, that had worked. It had built everything he had, everything he controlled. But standing there now, those same instincts felt incomplete, insufficient, because there was a part of that timeline he had never questioned, never revisited, and now it was the only part that mattered. And as the realization settled deeper, something else followed, quieter, sharper, the understanding that she had not been silent because she had nothing to say. She had been silent because she had already said it to someone who was not listening. And Ethan straightened slightly, his gaze sharpening as that thought took hold. Because if she had tried, if there had been a moment where she reached out and he had not been there to hear it, then this was not just about absence, it was about choice, his choice. And that shifted everything, slowly but completely. And he reached for his phone then, not out of habit, but with intention, scrolling through contacts until he stopped on a name he trusted to find answers he did not have. Marcus, his assistant, efficient, precise, someone who did not miss details, and Ethan pressed call, the line connecting almost immediately. "Sir," Marcus answered, steady as always. And Ethan did not waste time, his voice calm, but carrying a weight it did not usually. "Hold. I need you to find something," he said, pausing just long enough to choose his next words carefully. Because this was no longer a simple request, it was the beginning of something he could not yet fully see. Everything related to Zariah Coleman. Every message, every contact, anything that might have come through my office in the past year. There was a brief silence on the other end, not confusion, just processing. And then Marcus responded, "Understood, I will start immediately." And as the call ended, Ethan remained still for a moment, phone lowering slowly in his hand as he looked back out at the city, the lights unchanged, the world still moving as if nothing had shifted, but he knew better now. Because somewhere out there, a truth he had ignored was still moving forward without him. And for the first time, he was not certain he would be able to catch up. Morning arrived without ceremony, pale light stretching across the glass walls of Ethan Whitmore's office as the city below resumed its rhythm. But inside, nothing felt routine, because for once, he was not ahead of the day, he was catching up to something that had already begun without him. And Marcus stood across the desk, tablet in hand, posture straight, expression neutral, but there was a slight hesitation in the way he held the device, a subtle signal that what he had found did not fit cleanly into the patterns they were both used to. And Ethan noticed immediately, his gaze sharp, controlled. "You found something," he said, not a question, and Marcus nodded once, stepping forward, placing the tablet on the desk, and sliding it toward him. "Yes, sir," he replied, his tone measured. But it did not come through the usual channels. And that alone was enough to shift the air in the room, because nothing important in Ethan's world bypassed the usual channels unless someone had made a decision to redirect it. And Ethan looked down at the screen, his eyes scanning quickly, efficiently, until they stopped, until the movement slowed, because there it was, not dramatic, not highlighted, just a series of entries, timestamps, attempts that had been logged but never delivered, messages that had reached the edge of his system and stopped there. And his jaw tightened slightly as he scrolled, each line building on the last, a pattern forming that he could not ignore. "Explain," he said, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that did not invite delay. and Marcus straightened just slightly. Approximately 8 months ago, there were multiple contact attempts from a Zariah Coleman directed to your office. He began, choosing each word carefully. They were flagged by the screening system as non-priority and rerouted. Ethan's gaze did not lift from the screen, but something in his posture changed, subtle, controlled, but unmistakable. Rerouted where? He asked, and Marcus paused for half a second, just enough to acknowledge the shift. They were filtered through executive communications and did not reach your direct queue. And the implications settled in the room like something heavy finding its place, because Ethan knew exactly what that meant. It meant someone had decided those messages were not worth his time. It meant a system he trusted had made a judgment call on his behalf, and for the first time, that judgment had been wrong in a way that could not be corrected with a simple adjustment. And Ethan exhaled slowly, setting the tablet down with deliberate care, his fingers resting briefly against the edge as he processed what that meant, because this was not just about miscommunication, it was about a moment where the truth had tried to reach him and had been stopped, and that changed the narrative completely. Who authorized that filter? He asked, and Marcus met his gaze directly. It is part of the standard protocol approved last year to limit non-essential correspondence. And Ethan gave a slight nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because he remembered that decision. He remembered signing off on it without hesitation, without considering what might be categorized as non-essential when viewed from the outside. And now, standing in the middle of the consequence of that choice, it did not feel efficient. It felt incomplete. And he turned slightly, looking out over the city again, the same skyline that had always represented control now reflecting something else entirely. Because somewhere within that system he had built, something real had been filtered out, something that did not fit the structure he had designed. And he spoke again, quieter this time, but no less firm. Find the original messages, he said, and Marcus nodded immediately. Yes, sir, but Ethan was already moving past that, already recalculating, because retrieving the messages would explain the timeline, but it would not change the outcome. It would not erase the fact that she had reached out and he had not been there to hear it. And that realization settled deeper than anything else, because it was no longer about what she did or did not say. It was about what he had chosen to prioritize, what he had allowed to be filtered out of his world. And for the first time, that control felt flawed. And as the room fell quiet again, Ethan remained standing there, looking out at a city that had not changed, knowing that somewhere within it, Zariah Coleman had already moved forward without waiting for him. And this time, the distance between them was not measured in miles. It was measured in decisions he could not take back. The original messages arrived just after noon, not as a dramatic reveal, not as a single defining moment, but as a quiet sequence of lines restored from a system that had once dismissed them. And Ethan Whitmore sat at his desk with the screen pulled close, the world outside reduced to a blur of movement behind glass as he read them one by one, each message dated, timed, grounded in a reality he had never acknowledged. The first one simple, almost careful. I am not asking for anything. I just think you should know. And he paused there, his eyes holding on those words longer than necessary, because there was no accusation in them, no demand, just a statement offered without expectation, and that alone unsettled him more than anything else could have, because it did not fit the narrative he had already begun constructing in his mind. So he continued, scrolling down, the second message arriving 2 days later. I went to the appointment today. Everything looks healthy. And there it was. Again, that quiet tone, that absence of pressure, as if she had already decided she would carry this on her own whether he responded or not. And Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, his breath slower now, heavier, as the pieces began to align in a way he could no longer avoid. Because this was not a woman trying to pull him back into something. This was a woman informing him of something he had already missed, and he kept reading, because stopping now would have been easier, but it would not have changed the truth. The third message longer, more detailed. I understand if you do not respond. I know your life is different. I am not trying to disrupt that. I just did not want this to be something you found out too late. And that line settled deep, because it was exactly what had happened, exactly what he was living in now. A truth arriving too late, not because it had been hidden, but because it had been filtered out of his reach. And Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, just long enough to feel the weight of that, before opening them again, forcing himself to continue. The final message sent weeks later, shorter than the rest. "This will be my last message. Take care." And there was something final in that sentence, something resolved, like a door closing quietly without waiting to see if anyone would stop it, and Ethan set the tablet down slowly, his hand remaining on its surface as if grounding himself to something solid, because the clarity of it all left. No room for reinterpretation, no space to reshape the story into something more comfortable. She had reached out, she had given him the chance to know, and he had not been there, not because he chose to ignore her directly, but because he had built a system that decided for him. And that distinction no longer mattered, not when the outcome was the same, and the silence that followed felt different now, not empty, but full, filled with everything he had not seen, everything he had not questioned. And across the room, Marcus remained still, waiting, but Ethan did not look at him, not yet, because this was not something that required immediate action. This was something that required understanding, and that was new, unfamiliar, because understanding meant sitting with the discomfort of what he had missed, what he had allowed to pass by without recognition. And after a long moment, he finally spoke, his voice lower than usual, not lacking authority, but stripped of its usual distance. "She did not ask for anything," he said, more to himself than to Marcus. And Marcus gave a slight nod, acknowledging the observation without adding to it. Because there was nothing to add, the messages spoke for themselves, and Ethan stood then, moving away from the desk with slow, deliberate steps, his mind no longer racing, but focused, clear in a way it had not been before, because now the situation was no longer abstract, it was defined, it had a timeline, a sequence, a truth that could not be adjusted to fit his convenience. And as he reached the window again, looking out at the city that still moved without pause, he understood something he had not fully grasped until this moment, that Zariah Coleman had not been waiting for him. She had already made her decision, already built a path forward that did not include his approval, and whatever came next would not be about reclaiming control, it would be about stepping into something that had already begun without him. And for the first time, that did not feel like a loss of power, it felt like a responsibility he had not yet earned. The next morning did not wait for clarity, it arrived with movement, with noise, with the steady rhythm of a city that never paused for personal reckoning, and Zariah Coleman stepped into it with the same quiet certainty she had carried the day before, her coat pulled close against the cool air, one hand resting lightly against her stomach as she moved through the sidewalk crowd, not seeking space, not demanding attention, just navigating forward with the kind of presence that did not need acknowledgement to exist. And inside a modest brick building 3 blocks from the clinic, the elevator doors opened with a soft chime, revealing a small office space that smelled faintly of coffee and paper, a place built on effort rather than image. And she stepped inside, greeted by a familiar voice from across the room. "You are early today," her colleague said with a small smile, and Zariah returned it briefly, setting her bag down with careful ease. "Just getting a head start," she replied, her tone even, her movements measured, because routine mattered now, stability mattered, and she had built both without relying on anything outside of her control. And as she settled into her desk, pulling up documents and notes, her focus shifted completely, not to distraction, but to intention, because this was the life she had chosen, the one she had committed to. The moment she realized she would be moving forward alone, and she did not allow herself to revisit what had been, not because it did not matter, but because it no longer defined her direction. And across the city, in a space defined by glass and precision, Ethan Whitmore stood at the edge of a decision he could not delegate, his schedule already adjusted, meetings postponed, priorities reordered in a way that would have raised questions on any other day. But today, no one asked, because something in his demeanor made it clear this was not a moment to interrupt. And he reached for his coat with a deliberate calm, not rushed, not uncertain, just resolved in a way that felt unfamiliar, because this was not about control, it was about presence, and that distinction shifted everything. And as he stepped out of his building, the city greeted him the same way it always did, with movement, with expectation, but this time he did not move through it as someone above it. He moved through it as someone trying to find his place within it, his eyes scanning not for opportunity, not for advantage, but for a single point of connection he had missed before, and when he reached the address Marcus had provided, he did not hesitate. Not anymore. He stepped inside. The change in atmosphere immediate. No polished marble, no quiet assistance, just the low hum of everyday work, and he paused for a fraction of a second, taking it in, not judging it, not measuring it, just recognizing it for what it was, real, grounded, unaffected by his presence. And when someone at the front desk looked up, their expression shifting briefly in recognition before settling into professionalism. He spoke simply, without introduction, without title, "I am looking for Zariah Coleman." And the receptionist studied him for a moment, not intimidated, not impressed, just assessing, and then nodded toward the interior. "She is in the back office." And Ethan followed the direction given, each step measured, each movement carrying a weight he did not usually feel, because this was not a negotiation, not a transaction. This was something else entirely. And when he reached the doorway, he saw her, seated at her desk, focused, composed, exactly as she had been the day before, as if nothing in her world had shifted, and for a moment, he did not speak. Because the contrast between them was too clear, she had continued forward without pause. While he had spent the night catching up to a truth she had already accepted, and then she looked up, sensing his presence before he said a word, her eyes meeting his without surprise, without tension, just recognition. And in that moment, everything he had prepared to say felt unnecessary, because none of it would change the fact that she had already built a life that did not require him. And yet he stepped forward anyway, not to reclaim control, not to correct the past, but to finally stand in a moment he had once walked away from. And when he spoke, his voice was steady, but different now, stripped of assumption, grounded in something far more uncertain. "I read your messages," he said, and the words hung there, simple, direct, carrying more weight than any explanation could have. And Zariah held his gaze for a second longer before responding, her voice calm, unchanged. "Then you already know everything you need to know." And she returned her attention to her work, not dismissing him, not pushing him away, just continuing forward, leaving him standing there with the realization that knowing the truth was not the same as being part of it. And for the first time, Ethan Whitmore understood that this was not about finding his way back into her world. It was about whether he could earn the right to stand in it at all. The room did not change after she spoke, but something in the air did, something subtle that shifted the weight of the moment from expectation to reality. And Ethan Whitmore stood there for a second longer than necessary, his presence no longer commanding the space the way it once would have, because Zariah Coleman had already returned to her work, her attention steady, her posture unchanged, as if his arrival had been nothing more than a brief interruption in a day that mattered more than any conversation they could have. And that realization settled quietly but firmly, because for the first time, he was not the center of the situation. He was the variable, the one who had to adjust, and he did not move immediately, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, because this was not a moment to force, not something he could redirect with a stronger tone or a sharper argument. And after a beat, he stepped back slightly, not retreating, just giving space, something he was not used to doing. And when he spoke again, his voice carried less certainty, more intention. "I am not here to change what already happened," he said, choosing each word with care, because anything else would have sounded like control. And she did not respond right away, her pen moving across the page, finishing a line before she paused, setting it down with deliberate calm, then looking up at him again, her expression steady, unreadable in a way that did not invite interpretation. "Then why are you here?" she asked, and it was not confrontational, not sharp, just direct. And Ethan held her gaze, not looking away, because this time he understood that honesty was the only thing that would hold weight here. "Because I did not know," he said, and there was no defense in it, no justification, just a statement that acknowledged a gap he could not fill with excuses. And Zariah studied him for a moment, not searching for weakness, not testing him, just measuring the difference between what he was saying and what she had already experienced. And then she nodded once, a small movement that did not signal agreement, only acknowledgement. "You did not know because you were not there," she said, her voice calm but firm. And that distinction mattered, because it shifted the focus away from systems and decisions and placed it directly on presence, on choice, and Ethan accepted that without interruption, because arguing it would have been meaningless, and the silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was clear, defined, leaving no room for misunderstanding, and he stepped forward slightly, not closing the distance completely, just enough to show he was still there, still engaged. "I am here now," he said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than anything else he could have added, because it was not a promise, not a request, just a statement of fact, and Zariah's gaze did not soften, but it shifted, just slightly, as if acknowledging that presence, but not granting it significance yet. "That does not change what I have already built," she replied, her tone steady, grounded, and Ethan gave a small nod, because he had already seen that, already understood that this was not about stepping into an empty space. This was about entering a life that had been constructed without him. "I am not trying to take anything from you," he said, and that mattered, because it addressed something unspoken, something she had likely prepared for long before this moment. And she leaned back slightly in her chair, her arms resting loosely, not defensive, not closed off, just composed. "Good," she said simply, because anything else would have been unnecessary, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet hum of the office filling the space between them, papers shifting, distant voices carrying from another room, normal sounds that grounded the moment in something real, something unaffected by the weight of what was being said, and Ethan finally let out a slow breath, not of frustration, but of acceptance, because this was not a conversation that would resolve in a single exchange. This was a process, something that would unfold over time, if it unfolded at all, and he understood that now, in a way he had not before. And when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more measured. "What do you need?" he asked, not as a transaction, not as an offer of control, but as a question that placed the decision entirely with her. And Zariah held his gaze, her expression unchanged, but there was something in her eyes now, not softness, not resistance, just clarity. "I need you to understand that this is not about you showing up and fixing something," she said, each word precise, intentional. "This is about whether you can exist in a space where you are not in control." And that landed, because it challenged something fundamental in him, something he had built his entire life around. And Ethan did not answer immediately, not because he did not have one, but because for the first time, he was considering the weight of it before speaking. And when he finally nodded, it was small, but certain, because this was no longer about proving something. It was about learning something he had never had to before. And in that moment, standing in a space that did not revolve around him, Ethan Whitmore began to understand that being present was not enough. He would have to become someone who could stay. The day moved forward, but something had shifted beneath it, something neither of them named yet both of them carried. And Zariah Coleman did not stop her work, did not rearrange her routine, because she had learned long ago that stability was not something you waited for. It was something you built and protected. And across from her, Ethan Whitmore remained standing for a moment longer before finally stepping back, not out of defeat, but out of understanding, because forcing proximity would only prove he had not heard a word she said. And as he turned to leave, there was no dramatic exit, no lingering glance, just a quiet step away from a space that was not his to occupy yet. And the door closed softly behind him, the sound barely noticeable, but it marked something important, a boundary respected, a line not crossed. And Zariah did not look up immediately. She let the silence settle, let the rhythm of her work fill the space again before she finally paused, her hand resting lightly against the edge of her desk as she allowed herself one breath, just one, to acknowledge what had happened, not emotionally, not dramatically, just as a fact. He had shown up, and that mattered, but it did not change what came next, because showing up once was not the same as staying, and she had no intention of adjusting her life for something that had not proven itself consistent. And outside, Ethan stepped back into the flow of the city, but this time he did not move with the same certainty he once carried, because there was no immediate solution, no clear path forward, only a realization that this situation would not respond to pressure or speed. And for a man who had built everything on momentum, that was unfamiliar territory, and he walked without direction for a few blocks, his mind not racing, but processing, because what she had said was not complicated, It was precise. Exist in a space where you are not in control. And he understood now that this was not a single test. It was a condition, something that would define every step he took moving forward. And as he reached the corner of the street, he stopped, not because he had nowhere to go, but because for the first time, he was considering where he should go next without defaulting to habit. And that pause mattered, because it was a break from the pattern that had led him here. And back inside the office, Zoraya's phone buzzed softly against her desk, a reminder notification for her next appointment, and she glanced at it briefly, her expression unchanged, before gathering her things, slipping the sonogram carefully into her bag as if it were something far more valuable than paper. Because to her, it was not just an image, it was proof of a future she had already committed to, and she stood, moving with the same quiet confidence she had carried all day, stepping out of the office into the hallway, into the elevator, into the city that continued without pause. And when the doors opened at street level, the light felt warmer, the air more open, and she stepped into it without hesitation, her path clear, her direction chosen long before this moment. And across the street, Ethan saw her before she saw him, his gaze catching the familiar line of her posture, the steady pace of her steps, and he did not call out this time, did not interrupt, because something in him understood that not every moment required his voice, and instead, he watched, not with distance, but with attention, because this was part of learning, part of understanding the life she had built without him. And as she moved past him without noticing, blending into the crowd once again, Ethan remained still, not following, not stepping in, just allowing the moment to pass as it was, unforced, unclaimed, and for the first time, that did not feel like losing control. It felt like respecting something he had not earned yet. And as the city continued around them, loud and alive, two paths moved forward in parallel, close enough to see, but not yet close enough to meet, and somewhere between them, a quiet truth settled into place. That presence was not proven in a single moment. It was proven in what came after, in whether he would still be there when it was no longer convenient, no longer new, no longer uncertain. And for the first time, Ethan Whitmore was not planning the outcome. He was preparing to show up for it. Days passed without announcement, without dramatic change, just a steady continuation of two lives moving forward on their own terms. And Zariah Coleman did not look for him, did not expect him, because expectation had never been part of her process. She moved through her appointments, her work, her quiet evenings with the same grounded focus that had carried her this far, her hand occasionally resting against her stomach in small, absent gestures that spoke more of connection than concern. And the world around her remained unchanged, familiar, stable, something she had built piece by piece without relying on anything uncertain. And across the city, Ethan Whitmore adjusted in ways no one around him fully understood. His schedule still full, his responsibilities still demanding, but there were gaps now, intentional spaces he did not fill, moments where he chose to step away instead of stepping in. And those moments began to take shape, not loudly, not publicly, but consistently. Because for the first time, he was not trying to resolve something quickly. He was allowing it to unfold. And one afternoon, as the sun lowered into a softer light that stretched across the buildings, he found himself outside the same clinic again, not by accident, not by impulse, but by choice. And he did not go inside immediately. He stood across the street, watching the entrance, not searching for control, not planning an approach, just being present in a place that now carried meaning he could not ignore. And when Zariah finally stepped out, her pace steady, her posture unchanged, he did not move toward her right away. He waited, letting her see him if she chose to, letting the moment exist without forcing it into something else. And when her eyes lifted and met his, across the distance, there was no surprise in them, just recognition. And she paused briefly, not because she was uncertain, but because she was acknowledging the choice he had made to be there again. And Ethan crossed the street then, his steps even, his expression calm, not guarded, not assertive, just present. And when he stopped a few feet from her, he did not begin with explanation, did not reach for justification. He simply said, "I will be here." And the words were quiet, but they carried something different now, not urgency, not pressure, just consistency offered without condition. And Zariah held his gaze for a moment, her expression unchanged, but there was a shift, subtle, almost unnoticeable, the absence of resistance that had once been immediate, replaced now with something more measured, more observant, and she nodded once, not in acceptance, not in agreement, just acknowledgement, because she understood what he was saying, and more importantly, what he was not saying. He was not asking for anything in return, and that mattered, because it placed the responsibility entirely on him, and she turned then, continuing down the sidewalk, not inviting him to follow, not asking him to leave, simply moving forward as she always had. And this time, Ethan did follow, but at a distance that respected the boundaries she had set, his pace matching hers without closing the space between them. And for several blocks, they moved like that, two separate paths aligned in direction but not yet joined. And there was something steady in it, something quiet that did not need to be defined. And when they reached the intersection where their directions split, Zariah stopped, turning slightly toward him, her voice calm, her words clear. "Showing up once does not change anything," she said, and Ethan nodded, because he already knew that. "I am not here for once," he replied, and the simplicity of it held, because there was nothing else to add, nothing else that would make it more convincing than time itself. And Zariah studied him for a second longer before turning away again, stepping forward without hesitation, because her path had never depended on his. And as she walked, the city opening up in front of her, Ethan remained where he was for a moment, watching her go, not with urgency, not with fear of losing something, but with an understanding that this was not about catching up anymore. It was about keeping pace, and for the first time, that felt like something he was willing to learn, because somewhere between distance and presence, between what had been missed and what could still be built, a new kind of truth was forming, one that did not erase the past, but did not let it define the future either. And in that space, quiet and unclaimed, something real had finally begun.